Since 2013, Iraq and Syria and various coalitions have been at war with a terror group which controls large parts of each country, known as the Islamic State. They have a capital city, their own laws and currency, as well as their own tax system. They've inspired many terrorist attacks around the world in both Muslim majority and Western nations. As well as imposing Sharia law in what they call the Caliphate across Iraq and Syria, they also have smaller presences in multiple other countries. But how did they gain this much power? To tell the full story of the rise of the Islamic State, we need to look back at their origins. And the story starts in 1978 as the communist leader of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, Nur Mohammad Taraki, seizes power there in a military coup known as the Sur Revolution. He assassinated the former leaders and declared himself president of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union encouraged the change as the revolution brought power to the people under a religion-free communist system. Within a year though, a majority of the Afghan population began to rise against the government, and Taraki's Minister of Defence Hafizullah Amin successfully ordered PDPA staff to arrest him in September 1979. Amin claimed the presidency, and at his order his staff used pills to suffocate Taraki to death. Amin was still a communist, but his extreme policies shocked even the Soviet Union. With Amin losing ground to rebel forces, they decided to intervene and invade Afghanistan on December 24th. Within 3 days they killed Amin and installed their own puppet government with Babrak Karmal as the country's leader. The anti-communist uprising continued though, with major rebel groups starting to fight, led by the main resistance group, the Mujahideen. At this point during the Cold War, the United States were determined to fight communism at all costs. The extremist policies of some of the rebel groups, as well as possible direct engagement with the Soviet forces, deterred the US from invading. Instead, they gave the groups $20 billion in funding to help them overcome their common enemy in the Soviet Union. UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, a big critic of the Soviet Union and communism, met with them in Pakistan near the Afghan border, telling them,
"The hearts of the free world are with you."
Men from around the Muslim world joined resistance against the secular communist regime, so the Soviets continued to prop up Karmal, sparking a civil war. Regime change was happening the same year, not just in Afghanistan but in Iraq too. In July, Saddam Hussein also gained power in a coup and used totalitarian tactics to make the country fear him. His Sunni government began to terrorise Iraq's Shia Muslims and ethnic Kurds. He tried to invade Arab-inhabited areas in western Iran in 1980, leading to an almost ever-stagnant 8-year war. Iran's Ayatollah had also seized power in a coup in 1979 and formed the Islamic Republic. Both the United States and the Soviet Union opposed the change, which surprisingly saw both world powers take the same side, Iraq's, despite their use of chemical weapons. The wars were crippling the Soviet economy, and after successfully cooperating with the United States to end the Iran-Iraq War in 1988, they then pulled out of Afghanistan in 1989. Despite impoverishing his country with a needless war, Saddam Hussein attempted to annex neighbouring Kuwait with an eye on its oil just 3 years later in 1991. A US-led coalition of 30 other nations liberated Kuwait and cracked down heavily on Saddam Hussein. Despite his failed annexation, the coalition didn't overthrow it. Some of the Mujahideen still fighting in Afghanistan formed a new group, the Taliban, in 1994, who took over the country as its new government by 1996 thanks to the vacuum left by the now dissolved Soviet Union. Other fighters from the Mujahideen who had left Afghanistan joined Al-Qaeda, who returned to the Taliban-controlled country with a certain Saudi and Osama bin Laden as one of their senior leaders. A young Jordanian Islamist known as Abu Musab al-Zarqawi also left Afghanistan after the Soviets, but was sent to prison in Jordan in 1992 after explosives were found at his house. When he was released in 1999, he formed the jihadist group Jamaat al-Tawhid wal-Jihad, translating to Organisation of Monotheism and Jihad. This group went on to become the Islamic State, which is why 1999 is considered its official founding date. After the Al-Qaeda attacks on them in 9/11, the US started its global war on terror by invading Afghanistan hoping to kill bin Laden, but he and much of the group fled. Saddam Hussein's links to terror funding and chemical weapon possession led to the US then invading Iraq in 2003. Within just a few weeks, the US military gained large control over the country, planning to establish a new Iraqi government in time. Similar to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, jihadist groups again flooded into the fight, including some of Al-Qaeda and Zarqawi's group. He allied his group with Saddam-loyal former Iraqi soldiers as well as with Al-Qaeda. The group became known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became part of a Sunni uprising to fight the Americans and the newly elected Shia Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, leading to a religious Shia-Sunni war by 2006. In In June of that year though, the US killed Zarqawi in an airstrike, weakening Al-Qaeda, who lost all their territory in Iraq over the next few years, allowing the US to eventually begin withdrawal in 2011. Throughout 2011, a series of uprisings against state regimes known as the Arab Spring spread across North Africa and the Middle East. This saw the beginning of the overthrow of multiple dictators. Syrian civilians saw this and began protests against their dictator Bashar al-Assad. They began to escalate and eventually security forces fired gunshots at them in mid-March. Rebel groups in Syria began to form and started to rise against them, sparking a civil war. The main resistance group called itself the Free Syrian Army and was made up of protesters against the Assad regime and also by some soldiers from the regime's army who defected. Taking advantage of the power struggle, ethnic Kurds in the northeast started to fight to secede from Syria. The civil war became a proxy war with countries from around the world giving support to different sides. The rebels gained support from Sunni-led, mostly Gulf states, as well as Israel, Turkey and much of the West in the form of sanctions on the regime from the EU as well as other countries like Ukraine, Canada and the United States. Assad found equally important allies in both Vladimir Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China. He also gained support from Iran and Iraq, whose governments are Shia, and some Eastern European states. The civil war became another religious war between Shia states supporting Assad, who is Shia, and Sunni states supporting his opposition. It also created another proxy war between East and West. Terror groups from both sides of the religious divide trickled into fight. In August 2013, chemical weapons were used in the Syrian town of Ghouta, killing hundreds. Both sides blamed each other, but US President Obama, who claimed Assad was guilty, threatened him with airstrikes, albeit not following through. Instead, the United States began training and arming Syrian rebels. Assad, worried about the international support received by the rebels, reportedly freed jihadists from Syrian prisons as it poisoned the rebellion with extremism and discouraged more states abroad from supporting them. He had claimed from the beginning that the rebellion was a fundamentalist and jihadist movement, which at the time wasn't really true, but he tolerated and embraced the rise of extremism amongst his opposition. This was strengthened by the former members of Zarqawi's old group Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who regrouped and moved into Syria to capitalise on the unstable situation, but now under the name of the Islamic State in Iraq, led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Having gained some control of Iraqi ground near the Syrian border in mid-2013, some started fighting alongside the rebel forces, who at this point were still receiving weapons and funding from the Obama administration. The claimed territory in both countries became the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, claiming Syrian city al-Raqqa as its capital. They've since set the goal of establishing a worldwide caliphate and renamed themselves to just the Islamic State. Al-Qaeda's al-Nusra branch didn't want them in Syria, so they began to fight them, severing their ties in February 2014. In June of that year, Islamic State troops in northwestern Iraq marched south and east to try and gain ground in Iraq. Many Iraqi soldiers didn't want to fight for the new Shia state that discriminated against them as Sunnis, so they fled, allowing the Islamic State to gain most of the Sunni inhabited area, including the city of Mosul. Baghdadi went to Mosul in June and announced the beginning of the caliphate in a mosque there. The majority Sunni inhabitants were actually tolerant of the takeover, as they saw it as being better than living under discriminatory Shia rule, and some even moved to Mosul. Syrian President Assad says the war is less about territory as about winning back the hearts of Syrian civilians. In order for any side to win this mess of a war, they need civilian cooperation, which is why the Islamic State have been so successful, as they have offered Sunni Muslims an alternative to oppressive Shia rule in both countries. Similarly with Zarqawi though, Iraqi Sunnis soon began to reject the Islamic State's extremist policies, which has hindered them. As of April 2017, the Iraqi army has taken back most of the Islamic State's only urban Iraqi stronghold in Mosul. The Islamic State is surrounded by enemies on all fronts, but a lot of these enemies are also fighting each other, and the world powers are also split on the issue of who to support and who to fight. Although they are at least united in one fight. This division helps the Islamic State retain their territory, and not a lot of leading Republicans or Democrats in US politics have really pushed the idea of cooperating with the Syrian regime. Except the new president. Donald Trump has criticised many aspects of US foreign policy and has stated that allowing or assisting Syria's government to take back control could help stabilise the situation. Since Trump's election, Assad's forces recaptured the last significant urban territory in Aleppo from the rebels in a horrific battle, and in April 2017 another chemical gas attack killed nearly 100 civilians, and again the US blamed Assad. Trump, unlike Obama, did respond with a military strike against the regime, going back in his word to make peace with Syria. With the long-time US position being unclear and Russia and China continuing to veto UN action against Syria, it's unclear when the war and instability the Islamic State depends on will be resolved.